Good morning, everyone. My name is Colin, and I'm an instructor here in Redlands, California. Joining me today is Bruce Harold, who's a product manager in the desktop team here in Redlands. We want to welcome you all to today's live training seminar entitled Editing in ArcGIS 9, Tips and Tricks 4. Let's jump in and take a look at what the seminar is going to cover this morning. So we're going to cover four main topics: maintaining attribute data integrity, using subtypes for categorizing features, using domains for constraining attribute values, and assigning domains to subtype fields. The format of the seminar will be that each topic will be followed by a short software demonstration, a review of what we've just covered, and then there's some time for some questions and answers with Bruce. So please do send in your questions anytime during the presentation. Now, a little background to the motivation for this presentation. Many of you send us questions and ask us what sort of things you can do to maintain attribute data integrity. So what can you do to ensure that people don't put the wrong spelling into a field in an attribute table? Or can we have them get a queue or a drop-down list of something rather than having to type in something whenever they're busy populating attributes for data? So the motivation for this presentation was really to learn more about the different techniques and tools and methods that can be applied in maintaining attribute data integrity. Now, some of those tools and mechanisms are part of the field properties, others are part of the geodatabase, and then some can be a combination of both. The field property tools and mechanisms fall into some broad categories. The first is the use of default values. Next would be the option to set the allow null values to a yes or no. And the third would be to assign or to categorize your data via subtypes. Now, all three of those are field properties. Geodatabase properties, on the other hand, involve the ability for you to create and assign domains. In other words, restrictions, if you like, to what values can be placed in a field. You may also use relationship classes and relationship rules in the geodatabase as another mechanism, and we won't be covering those during this presentation, though. And then lastly, you may want to combine some of these field and geodatabase properties together. For example, you may want to set subtypes and default values, or you may want to combine a subtype with some domain restrictions for other fields. And so we'll cover that in topic 4. Now let's take a look at these mechanisms in practice and in play and see how they work. So here's a table with some information, some attribute information, and notice how I've taken the content of the type field and I have subtyped or categorized those content into 3 different groups or subtypes. I may further constrain or limit what kind of values or strings may be placed for additional attributes such as species name via what we call a coded value domain. So pelagic fish has a different list of possible variations, whereas finfish have another list of variations that could be used for that attribute field. Another of the tools or mechanisms we have is to apply a range domain, a minimum or maximum limit to the value that can be typed in for a field. And we see the example here of the number of imports per ton of a specific species of fish to the United Kingdom. Also notice this null value down here, and that's another one of the constraints that can be, not constraints, but attribute validation techniques that can be applied. So a field can have either a 0 or an empty string or an actual null within it. And the last of the mechanisms is the ability for us to set default values. And then, so as we capture a new feature and its attributes are populated, the default value may populate with something specific based on that default value. Now, we're going to go through all of these in the next hour or so you'll learn a little bit more about them. So let's take a look at default values. So the idea with default values is that as we capture new features, as we add some new features, the attributes are automatically populated with the content of the default values. In this case, 3 new point features were added, and their default fish species type was populated with the word bass. Notice also the count field was populated with 100. The average weight, however, was populated with a 0, and the date field was populated with a date. We didn't do anything. We were using null value option and default values there. Now let's talk about this allow null values property of a field. So technically speaking, you have the option of saying to our software, anytime a new record is or new feature is created and an attribute is populated, if I've set allow null values to yes, what I want you to do is I want you to physically put in the word or make that field value null. Not zero, not an empty string, it's an actual null. Now be very careful here because something that is a null will be ignored for a lot of functions. So if you did say a statistics or summary of some sort, nulls are ignored. But if you did set the value for allow null values to be yes, it won't populate with null as we notice here for this fish species field. It'll actually populate with an empty string. So if you did set the allow null value choice to no, it defines what we call a DBMS, a database management system not null constraint. So the field cannot have a null within it. It has to be populated with something. And in the case of a string field, that something would be an empty string, quote, quote, or in the case of a numerical field, that would be a zero would be added. Now you could think to yourself, if I have a zero there, is that statistically significant? Yes, it might be. So this is the reason why you may want to choose the default option for allow null values for a field to be yes, where it'll actually place the physical null in the field, not a zero and not an empty string. Now let's stop here for a minute and let's take a look at a short demonstration just to show you the actions of null values. So I'm going to enter into the ArcMap, ArcCatalog environment. I'm going to open up demo 1. I'm going to open up a feature class called fish sightings. Now within the fish sightings properties, if I looked at the fields, I see I have a field called habitat that's an integer field. It has nothing defined, and I'm going to leave it this way. I have a date cited field. It's defined as a date. Now date fields do not require me to put any default value in. They auto-populate with the current date on your machine, on your computer. Average weight, I have nothing at this point in time. So perhaps what I will do is I may change the average weight to a value, but I'm going to leave it at this point because I want you to notice that we've set the allow null values to no for the average weight field. The count field, I am going to set a default value of, say, 100. My fish species field, again, I'm going to set a default value here, and I'm going to say the default is bass. Now, my yield field, this one has allow null values set to yes. So if you think back, what do you expect is going to happen? It's going to have the actual wording null, so it's an empty field. Won't have a zero, won't have an empty string. It'll have a null within that field. I'm going to leave this one that way. Now let's apply these changes. Let's choose the OK button, and let's go on and open up ArcMap. So I'm going to launch up ArcMap here very briefly. And the reason why I haven't got ArcMap open, by the way, is that anytime we make a change to field properties or anything within the geodatabase, we're performing what's called a schema edit. And if you do a schema edit, you can't have ArcMap open because there will be a lock applied. All right, so what we have in front of us here is a feature class called fish sightings. And we have the date field, the average weight field, the count field, the fish species, and the yield field. Let's go ahead and create a new fish sighting. So I'm going to move my data a little further up. I'm going to start editing. And my fish sighting is my target layer. My task would be to create a new feature. And I'm going to be using the pencil sketch tool. So let's go and create a new fish sighting here in this freshwater zone within the Clark River. And as soon as I did, let's see what happened. So the date field auto-populated with today's date. The average weight field was given a value of 0. That's because allow null values was set to no. So this field could not be null. It had to have something in it. And since it was a numeric field, 0 was what was placed in there. The count field was given the value 100, which was my default value. The fish species field was given the value bass, my default, and my yield species, yield field became null. So this was technically what the allow null yes option did, is it made this a null record in that field. Now let's add a few more features, and you'll see as I add more features, the same default values and the same actions occur based on the null value setting. Right, I'm going to stop here and let's exit out, and we won't be saving any changes. And let's return back to our presentation. And so in our last section, we spoke about default values and we spoke about null values. Now, Bruce, would you like to take some questions from folks, please?
Certainly, Colin. Michael from Anchorage asks, can all data types have a null value? Well, Michael, when you're creating a feature class or table using, say, ArcCatalog, then you'll see the allow null values property in every type of data field that you create. However, if you, say, create a feature class and the database administrator in your SD database adds a constraint or a type of data which cannot be null, such as a sequence, then those types of data with those special constraints on them may not have null values. Chris from Riverside asks, is there a way around having to close ArcMap if I'm trying to make schema changes in ArcCatalog on a feature data set that's in the ArcMap document? There are a couple of ways around this, Chris. First, you might disconnect from the geodatabase which ArcCatalog is looking at, I beg your pardon, ArcMap looking at, and operate then, or perhaps close ArcCatalog entirely and use the geoprocessing tools within ArcMap to do your schema edit. Joanne from Cleveland asks, when looking at a table, is it possible to determine which fields have subtypes and which ones have domains? Well, not by looking at the table dialog itself, Joanne. You need to go into ArcCatalog and inspect the subtypes and domains in that application. Mitch from Lincoln asks, is there a way to overwrite default fields when creating new data? That is, I don't want this feature. Well, Mitch, you could allow null values for the field, in which case you don't have to have a default value appear. Mark from Tucson asks, what about training courses? Where can I learn more about subtypes and domains? And by the way, I can't afford to travel at this time. Well, Mark, if you open a web browser and go to training.esri.com and search for training classes with the word subtype, you'll see at least 2 which are available as virtual campus courses, with the first course free. So that's an option for you. Time for one last question. Whenever I work with subtypes, this is, by the way, Anthony from Corpus Christi. Whenever I work with subtypes, I'm always running into locks. Can you explain exclusive and shared locks and how they relate to editing subtypes? As Colin mentioned, creating or amending subtypes requires a schema edit on the geodatabase. To effect a schema edit, you must have an exclusive lock on the geodatabase. For personal and file geodatabases, this means you can only be the sole person accessing the geodatabase. For enterprise geodatabases and SDE, you must be the sole person accessing a particular feature class or table. Now I'll hand back to Colin.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Right, folks, do keep sending in those questions so that we can try and answer some of them for you. Now, our second topic is using subtypes to categorize features. A clue already. What is a subtype? Well, a subtype or subtyping is the mechanism we have in our geodatabase to group features within a single feature class or table. In other words, instead of you creating separate feature classes for every different grouping of, let's say, fish species, you create one feature class of fish species, but you differentiate those different species within the feature class via the subtype. So with subtyping, there's no need for you to group or create separate feature classes. You create one feature class and then group the features individually within that feature class. Now you might say to yourself, well, what are the implications of this? Why do I want to do this? Well, think about it for a minute. It means that when you start capturing a new feature, instead of capturing a generic, bland, common feature, you're capturing an individual feature that may already have some properties, some default values assigned to it before you start capturing. So you'll see the little drop down here. As I start editing and create a new freshwater sighting or a new dual water sighting or a new saltwater sighting. And by default, those new features that are created by the subtype characteristic have the properties of that subtype assigned to them. So Subtypes are a property of a field within a feature class or table. In other words, only one subtype may be created per feature class or table, and it's based on, and we'll learn this a little later, on an integer field. The key motivation for having subtypes is that they are going to categorize or group our features within a single feature class, and they're going to significantly improve performance of the geodatabase. Now, I wanted to show you one of the characteristics of a subtype before we went on. And I'm going to open up my second demonstration folder here. And I want to show you under the Preview tab in our catalog very briefly what a feature class looks like with no subtypes. So you'll notice that all the features are managed and handled exactly the same way. They're all one generic feature. But if subtyped, the features automatically symbolize based on that subtype category or description that they are grouped within. So features of one group are symbolized that way and have properties unique from features in another group. So I have, in this case, 3 different subtypes here, but this one subtype has 2 features within it. The same action, by the way, of symbolization occurs in ArcMap as well if you entered into ArcMap. All right, now let's move on a little and let's take a look at some of the characteristics of a subtype. So a subtype requires an integer field in the feature class or table. So you always have to have an integer field defined to use as the subtype field. Notice on the graphic here, my habitat field with values 1s, 2s, and 3s represent the subtype field. Now, when you define the subtype, you as a user will add a description for each code, subtype code or value. Later, you'll also be able to assign different default values per subtype. As you see here, freshwater has pike fish species as its default. And then later, you may also want to define different attribute rules per subtype. And some of those attribute rules may be defined via domains, and some of them may be defined via relationship classes and relationship rules if need be. Now let's move on a little and let's take a look at how you go about creating a subtype. So a subtype, you know, is a property of a feature class or a table. So in order to generate or assign a subtype, you need to go into the feature class or table, and you need to go and make sure that you pick the subtype tab. Now on the graphic that you see here, I'm showing you the subtype tab, and I've chosen a habitat with values 1s, 2s, and 3s to represent my subtype field. Next, you type in the actual code value and a description. Remember, the description is useful to your end user who's going to be using the table. They get that drop down and during the edit session it says, oh, is it a freshwater sighting? Is it a saltwater sighting? Or is it a dual water sighting? So they get to read the description rather than see the code. Now, once you've defined those different input codes and descriptions, you need to pick one of them as your default. And then finally, if you choose to, per subtype, you can go and change what the default values for other fields may be, or, as we'll learn a little later, you may also assign a domain to different fields within subtypes. So every field in a subtype can have its own default values different from another subtype's default values. So each subtype is kind of like a unique grouping within the same feature class with its own defaults and domain values if need be. Now let's move on a little further, and here are some of my tips and tricks. So it can be fairly time consuming to go ahead and create subtypes if there are many codes and many descriptions. And also if you're dropping them and recreating them and so on from time to time, or if you just want to add new ones from time to time, one of the ways to automate the process and make it a lot simpler is to use the geoprocessing environment. So from the data management toolbox, the subtypes toolset in Arc Toolbox has some tools to add a subtype, remove a subtype, to set a subtype as the default, and then also to assign or set the subtype field. So the little model I'm showing you here is showing you how I've set the subtype field, created 3 subtypes, and made one of those subtypes the default. Now, one of the really big things about subtyping is both that categorization, but also the ability for you to choose the subtype you'd like to create while editing. So as I add new features and I've chosen the subtype of the feature I'm adding, that feature will inherit all the default values that were assigned to that subtype. So in the example here, you'll see I've captured a new freshwater fish sighting, and the default type of fish that was cited was trout, and the symbol was green. But if I, for some reason, change the subtype to dual zone, now the default fish cited was salmon, and the color changed to a magenta color, for example. And then similarly, if I change that sighting to saltwater, now the cited fish is habitat as halibut, and also the symbol has changed. So subtyping uniquely categorizes or groups features and then lets them inherit the properties, the attribute default values of that subtype. So this really makes it a lot more efficient for you to capture new features, and it really makes sure that your data, your attribute data, is validated right there when you're busy capturing. Now, I want to stop here for a minute and show you a short little software demonstration in which I'm going to go and set some subtypes. So I've got some features in my fish sighting data set. And remember, subtypes require an integer field. So I'm going to build my subtypes on this habitat field, which is an integer field. And I'm going to switch to the subtype tab. Now, right now, I have no subtype set. So my next job would be to go ahead and specify the field on which to generate the subtypes, habitat. Then I need to specify the code value. Now, I know that habitat has codes 1, 2, and 3, one for freshwater, and that would help if I spelt a little better, right? 2 would be saltwater, and 3 would be our dual zone. Now, one of these has to be specified as the default, so I'm going to choose freshwater as the default. Now, for each of these subtypes, I have the ability to also go and set additional default values. Now, we've already learned about default values, so I'm going to change the average weight of a fish caught in a freshwater environment to, say, 6.5 pounds. The average weight of saltwater, I'm going to change that one to, say, 22.7 pounds. So let's do that. And I'm going to change the average weight of fish in a dual zone, and that one I'm going to make around 15.25, right? So I've set 3 different default values, each one unique to the different subtypes. Let's choose apply, let's hit OK, let's refresh the database, and then let's go and open up a map document. And in this map document, what we'll do is we will go ahead and edit. All right, ArcMap is opening up, and we'll show you the effect of using subtypes during an edit. So here we have ArcMap, and we have the familiar data, which is our fish sightings within this Clark River area. And let's start editing. Now, before I edit, I'm going to open up the attributes dialog. And I'm just going to keep this handy so that you can see the effect of the different subtype changes. So now, instead of choosing a generic fish sighting to capture, I have to choose one of the subtypes. So I'm going to choose a saltwater sighting. Then I'm going to use my pencil sketch tool and capture a new saltwater sighting. So notice that at this point, the average weight was set to 22.75. If for some reason I realize that this was, that I want to capture another sighting, let's say a dual zone sighting, now I capture the dual zone sighting, and now the average weight is 15.25. If I captured a freshwater sighting, the weight was 6.5. But what if I realize that this new sighting I'm about to capture, well, actually, it's not freshwater, it's dual zone. I can go ahead and change the subtype to dual zone. And now I get the properties of dual zone fish sightings assigned to it. So in a nutshell, that's how subtyping works. It categorizes features via a field within the same feature class for us. Now let me shut down ArcMap here. And before we proceed, we will have a quick review just to talk about what we looked at. So in this last section, we spoke about the characteristics of subtypes. We've looked at how to create subtypes within the feature class properties and how we could do so through geoprocessing. And then we looked at how we could edit subtypes in ArcMap. Bruce, would you like to take a few questions for us, please?
Certainly, Colin. Tom from Winona asks, can you add subtypes and domains to a feature class in an existing geodatabase? You certainly can, Tom. You might use ArcCatalog and do this interactively, or might use the geoprocessing tools for subtypes and domains within ArcMap or Catalog. Ken from Kissimmee asks, I have feature classes that could contain a large number of subtypes, 20 or 30 or more. Is there a way to subtype a subtype or create a lower level of classification? Well, Ken, subtypes don't exist at the one level. You cannot subtype a subtype. But some approaches you might like to look at would be grouping your subtypes within sets of integer values, say 10 to 19, 20 to 29, and so forth, and then using definition queries on those ranges of values to give you another logical grouping. Larry from Avondale asks, how do we set multiple default values? Well, there's only one default value possible for any particular field, Larry, but with subtypes, you can have a different default value per subtype. Chris from Edmonton asks, in an edit session, how do you replace empty strings with a null? Well, you might use the field calculator, Chris, and calculate your field to be equal to the null keyword. Michelle from Fort Lauderdale asks, you said map has to be closed to affect schema changes, but what about SDE locks? Does everybody have to be disconnected out and off? No, Michelle, they do not have to be disconnected. You can, as a user, affect a schema change on a single feature class or table yourself, as long as you have the permissions and you're able to have a unique, an exclusive schema lock for just you. Other people can continue to work with the layers which they're accessing. Yoav from Tampa asks, can a field be populated based on a formula, such as an area updated to acres instead of square feet? Yes, Yoav. If you go and use the field calculate option by right-clicking on a field in say, the table dialog, you'll see the option to calculate on geometry. You can say recalculate an area to be that units of acres instead of square feet using a simple dialog. Vince from Aurora asks, can the null value be changed from yes to no after it has been set? Well, only when you're in the dialog where you're doing the schema edit before you hit OK or apply. Once you've hit OK or apply in the schema edit, then no, you cannot change the property. You might add another field, though, with a different value for the property, calculate your old values into new ones, and carry on with that field. I'll hand back to Colin.
All right, Bruce, thank you. I'm going to take one quick question here. There was a question that was an interesting one, is can I set subtypes between relationship classes? That was Matt from San Antonio. And Matt, yes, you can. If you have a relationship set up and you want to, you can have different relationship rules between subtypes if you wish to. Very powerful function that, unluckily, we don't have the time to cover relationships and relationship classes here, but it's something you may want to take a look at. There are some classes such as building geodatabases, which is an instructor-led class, which actually covers that in much more detail. Now let's take a look at our third topic for this morning, and that is using domains to constrain attribute values. So the first question you may have in your mind is what is a domain? So why do I want to use it? What does it do for me? Now, domains within the geodatabase are mechanisms, or is a mechanism, to indicate what valid values a user may input for a field or for fields within a subtype. So essentially what domains are used for is to enforce data integrity. So domains are used to limit or restrict what somebody may put into an attribute field as a value or string. Little different from domains, by the way, from subtypes. Subtypes are used primarily to categorize features within a feature class, whereas domains are used to limit or enforce data integrity by specifying what may or may not be put into an attribute field. So one of the things that a domain does is it can limit a numeric range value for a field to within a specific minimum and maximum, like we see here, a range of 1 to 25. Somebody entered a value of 100. not allowed. So they were given a message. The other thing a domain will do is restrict values to a specific defined set. So here somebody is capturing a saltwater fish sighting, and they're being limited or restricted to entering one of these three, halibut, grouper, or tuna fish species that might be seen in salt water. So domains enforce data integrity by limiting numeric range values and restricting field values to a defined set. When you look at domains, or where you try and find them, they are a property of the geodatabase. So you right-click on the geodatabase and go to its properties, and the domains tab will be one of the options you have in the geodatabase properties. Now you'll notice that domains have a name which needs to be unique within the geodatabase. They also have a description, and then they have properties such as which field type can they be applied to, and whether they are range or coded value domains. You'll also notice that I have a little R and a little CV at the end of the name of these different domains. Those indicate whether they're range or coded value domains to me as a user, and even to my end user who sees the description of the domain. So two types of domains. There's one type known as a range domain that defines a range of numeric values allowed for a field, basically a minimum and maximum value. So you see I'm showing you an example here of saltwater range that has a min value of 10.5 and a max of 40.75. But the domain may also have coded values. Coded values, or a coded value domain, doesn't have a min-max, it has a code number and a description describing what it is. The way to think of a coded value domain, which I kind of do too, is think of it as a lookup table. It says, oh, I'm only allowed to choose one of these. This code represents that description. So the code and the description are really maintained as part of the coded value domain. Where would I create domains? So I know they're created as part of the geodatabase, but I can also create domains using geoprocessing tools. And these can be done by using the tools found in the domains toolset of the data management toolbox in ArcCatalog, in ArcToolbox. There are many tools you'll see. There is a create coded value domain tool, create range domain tool. There is an add code value, set min max value for range domain. But two of the tools I particularly like, by the way, are domain to table, which will take a coded value domain and convert it to a table that I can manipulate. And then there is a table to domain, which will take a attribute table and allow me to generate a domain from that attribute table. So those are two tools that I particularly like here as part of geoprocessing. Keep in mind, the whole reason for these geoprocessing tools is really to automate the process of generating a database with these domains within them. So once a domain is being created, how do I go about assigning the domain to a field? So this is done from the Field tab, and I pick the appropriate field, in this case, my fish sighted field. And then from the properties of that field, which I see towards the bottom end here, I go to the domain property, and I pick the drop-down list and apply a particular domain to that field. So that's how I assign a domain to a field within a table or feature class within the geodatabase. Now, little interesting thing here. Domains can be applied to every field in a feature class, whereas subtypes or grouping can only be one field, and only one subtype is allowed per feature class. So the subtype's role is to categorize or group. The domain's role is to limit or restrict what can be put into a field. So every field can have some of those restrictions or limits within a feature class or table via a domain if you wish. So what about editing with a coded value domain? How do I go about editing? So with a coded value domain, at any point in time where I want to populate a field, I click on that field's textual information or value, and the coded value domain gives me a drop-down list of things to pick from. So I can't choose anything else outside of the coded value domain. In the case of a range domain, The process is a little different. I can pretty much type in any value for the field that has a range domain applied. But it's only when I go to the editor menu and choose validate features that this value that I've typed in is actually validated against the min and max within the range domain. And in this example here, I'm seeing a message return saying my weight value of 100 is greater than the range 1 to 25. So it's essentially saying, I'm warning you, you're doing something wrong here. Now you can auto-validate if you wish to by going to the Tools menu in ArcMap and go the Options option under Tools menu. And within that Options tab, there's a Table tab. You can set the auto-validate. The only problem with auto-validate is that as you make a change, so it auto-validates. As you make a change, so it auto-validates. So that could be a little tedious if you're doing many, many edits to have it auto-validate for you. Right, now let's move on a little further and let's have a quick look at these domains and how we do them and how we set them in a little demonstration. So I'm going to enter into ArcMap and I'm going to open up my demonstration 3. Now, recall that domains are a property of the geodatabase. So I right-click the geodatabase properties and I go to my domains tab. Now, in my domains tab here, you'll notice that I have several domains already created. Let's see how we create a new domain. So I go to an empty space and I'm going to call this new weight domain. And I'm not going to give any description at this point, but I could if I wanted to. I'm going to assign this new weight domain to a floating point field. It's going to be a range domain. So floating point field, and it's going to be a range domain, and it may be 1 to 50, for example. So the restriction that this particular domain is going to apply is between 1 and 50 as a floating point value to a field if I eventually apply it to a field. That's how easy it is to create a domain. To create a coded value domain, let's call this new fish species. Again, I could put a description in. I choose the type of field I'm assigning this to. I choose whether it's coded or value. This is coded. And I type in the code, and I type in what it is I may want to place as a description for those codes. Now, to save a little space and a little time, I'm actually going to delete these two. I'm going to show you another technique for creating a domain. Let's apply, let's choose OK. Now, within my geodatabase, I have a table called all fish. And in it, I have habitat, which represents codes, and I have species, which represents a description. Why don't I make a domain from a table using a tool? So I'm going to bring up my Arc Toolbox environment, and I'm going to go to my Data Management Toolbox and Domains toolset, and I'm going to use this Table to Domain option. Now, the input table, I'm going to specify as all fish. From this table, which field represents the code? Well, recall Habitat did that for us. Which field represents the description? Species. Which database are we putting this into? Fish and Game. What is the name for it? Well, let's call this new fish species. Do I have a description for the domain? I'm just going to leave it as it is. Let's choose the OK button. Okay, so I previously did this, so this domain already exists. So I'm just going to choose to cancel. And let's go to the properties again and see if we can find it. And here it is, new all fish species. So if it had worked, which it had earlier, I now have code values and descriptions derived from the table that I originally used to generate the domain from. So what do we want to do next? Well, to assign a domain to a field, I would go to my fish sightings, properties. I choose the field. I would choose the field that I want to assign to. And then from the domain option, I choose the actual domain. So new all species, or in my case, all species represents the same thing. So now I've assigned a domain to a field. How do I use this domain within an edit? Well, let's go to ArcMap And let's open up the ArcMap environment here. There we go. So we're launching up ArcMap, and we'll see how the domain is going to be used. So now, familiar data again. Let's do the start edit. Let's choose a new fish sighting in a saltwater zone. Let's bring up the attribute dialog, keep it handy, and let's go and create a new saltwater sighting. Aha, so here's my new sighting, and it's saltwater. Default was salmon, but look, if I click on salmon, I now have the option of choosing any one of these additional types instead of the default that was chosen. And that is a coded value domain list that you're looking at there. Also remember the average weight. Let's put in an average weight of, say, 125. And let's go to the editor menu and let's validate. And oh, 125 is outside of your range of 1 to 25. So my message is returning to me. And those are two examples of a coded value domain and a range domain being used during an edit with a subtype. Interesting. Let's move on a little further and let's exit out of this. And I think we're ready to summarize very quickly what we spoke about in this section. So we spoke about range encoded value domains. We've learned how to create a domain. It's a property of the database. We've also learned how we could use geoprocessing tools. And then we learned a little bit about editing with the domain in ArcMap. Bruce, would you like to take some questions from everyone, please?
Certainly, Colin. Larry from Auburn asks, is this functionality available in all versions of ArcGIS? Which version of ArcGIS are you using? Well, Larry, Colin happens to be using ArcInfo, but he's operating on file geodatabases. Everything that you see him doing with ArcInfo, you can do with the ArcView and ArcEditor license levels. Donna from Conyers asks, can I have more than one subtype linked to a domain? If subtypes equals something, then one domain. If subtypes equals something else, then another domain. Yes, you can, Donna. If you go to the feature properties dialog for a feature class in ArcCatalog, click on the subtypes tab, you'll see a grid there. One value for the subtype, each value row there. If you look at default values in domain, you can set the domains with the granularity of the subtype. Yo from Tampa asks, can you have different fields? The actual fields show up or turn off by subtype. No, you can't, Yo. The field visibility is a property of a layer, and this does raise the question of whether or not it's appropriate that you try and use subtypes when what you're really trying to do is have a different effective schema for different features in your feature class. If you really are trying to have a different schema, then subtypes might not be the solution for you. Greg from Honolulu asks, when adding features to a fresh or salt or dual zoned area, does the spatial area prohibit adding the wrong fish type? No, it doesn't, Greg. This is a very good question. We could, if we wished, add relationship classes which would give functionality like deleting the sea would delete all the sea salt living fish. But a better way to approach this problem might be to use a geodatabase topology so that saltwater fish can only exist inside the sea zone. Promod from Hartford asks, can we use domains and subtypes together? Certainly you can, Promod, and Colin will show you some rich functionality using the two of them together. Got time for one more. Brent from Noonan asks, does using subtypes increase the size of the MXD? No, Brent, it doesn't. All the behavior that you see around subtypes exists in the geodatabase itself or within the ArcMap or ArcCatalog application. There's no effect on the size of the MXD. I'll hand it back to Colin.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Bruce. So our next topic is assigning domains to subtype fields. And I noticed we had a question from Donna in Conyers about asking about whether subtypes can have different domains assigned to them. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about now, Donna. So let's take a look at subtypes and domains. Now, before we continue with the slide, I need to clarify a few things for you. Domains and subtypes can be independently applied in the database, or they can be applied together. In other words, the use of a subtype and a domain together can be very, very mutually beneficial. And in fact, they make the whole experience of editing a much richer experience, and that your attribute data validation is that much better if you combine subtyping and domains together with each other. But remember, the goal of subtyping is to categorize or group features, whereas the goal of domains is to restrict or limit what may be put into attribute fields. So we can assign different domains per subtypes, different validation of attribute fields based on those subtypes that are chosen. So let's look at the example here. I have a street feature class, and within that street feature class, I have two subtypes, one called local, one called highway, and the subtypes were defined on an attribute field called class. For the local subtype, I want to restrict the kind of roads, the kind of streets, to ST, RD, AV, and BLVD. But then for highway, I want to restrict them to a different set of or group of codes, highway and freeway. So by combining subtypes and domains together, in other words, restricting per subtype via a domain, I'm really doing a combination of field characteristics with geodatabase properties and characteristics. Looking at the next example, I've done something very similar. I have power pole features that have been subtyped or grouped into two groups, wood and steel. And then for wood, I have a range domain of height of 20 to 30 feet, whereas for steel, I have a height domain of 30 to 50 feet. So different ranges for different subtypes within the same feature class. So this combination of subtypes and domains makes for a very, very rich, rewarding, and a much better validated experience to the end user. So how do I go about assigning domains to a subtype? So this is done from the subtype tab of a feature class or table. And I pick the individual subtype, in this case, freshwater has been chosen. And then what I do is I go to the properties of the subtype way down the bottom of this tab, and you'll see that for every attribute field, I can now specify a domain specific to that field via the subtype. So for freshwater subtype, I want to limit the fish sightings to freshwater fish sightings in that subtype. Then for saltwater, I want to limit the fish sighted to only those in saltwater. And for those found in the dual zone, I want to limit those to only the fish found within the dual zone. So I have different domains applied to the different subtypes. And I do this in the subtype tab. Very powerful, very, very useful to do. Another way to do this is to use the geoprocessing tools. And we have a tool called Assign Domain to Field. So you input the feature class or table, and you specify the field on which you would like to define the domain. If that field happens to be the subtype field, then you will see a list of subtypes below. You would check the subtype you want to use and specify the domain to associate to the habitat field for that subtype. So you could do this via the geoprocessing tools as well if you wanted to. Now I'm going to stop here for a minute and do a very quick demonstration to show you how to assign subtypes to domains, and then show you how we edit with these before we take some fun questions. So we're in ArcMap, and we open up our geodatabase, and I spent a little time before this presentation taking that all fish list and breaking them into fish that are dual habitat, fish that are freshwater, and fish that are found primarily in saltwater. So I have 3 different coded value domains with the different fish species. I also have taken the saltwater weight range and created a range domain for saltwater, freshwater, and for dual zone. So I actually have 6 different domains. Now, how do I go about assigning those domains? So what I would do is I'm going to go to my fish sightings feature class, go to the properties, go to the subtype tab. Now, for the first subtype, freshwater, I'm going to say for the fish sighted field, I want to assign freshwater fish. For the average weight field for the freshwater subtype, I want to assign the freshwater weight range domain. For saltwater, I'd like to do the same thing. For the fish cited field, I want to assign the saltwater fish domain. Same for the range. For the dual subtype, same thing. I want to assign a specific domain for the dual fish. So in this way, per subtype, you pick the subtype, you set the domains. So each domain individually has, each subtype has its own set of domains applied. Now I'm done, and I'm going to go back and enter into ArcMap. So let's launch up the ArcMap environment here, and let's take a look at how this is done. So ArcMap is on its way up, and here we go. Again, some familiar territory for you. Start the editing environment, and let's open up the attribute dialog here. Let's keep the attribute dialog handy. We're going to be creating some new features. Now let's see. So we're going to start this time with fish sightings. I'm going to be creating a new saltwater fish sighting subtype. Then I'm going to create the feature, and notice that the attribute dialog is showing me that the default fish sighted is halibut. If I click the drop down, I now get to choose from the seawater or saltwater fish their domain. So this is the coded value domain for saltwater. If for some reason I change the domain to say freshwater, now my coded value domain is to choose one of the freshwater fish. So these two things, subtype and domain, are mutually very, very complementary to each other. They do not have to be used together, but they're very, very powerful if combined. So for each individual subtype, I have different domain characteristics. And the same would be true for the weight field. I'd have a different weight range per different subtype that I've chosen. Now I'm going to stop at this point and a quick summary of what we've just spoken about. So we've learned about assigning domains to subtype fields. We've learned about how subtypes are a property of the feature class. And we've learned about how the domain is a property of the geodatabase, and that how you can assign different domains per subtype if you choose to. So let's take some questions from Bruce here, and then we'll finish off in a few more minutes. Bruce?
Thank you, Colin. Dan from Nanaimo on Vancouver Island asks, I have a feature class that has 15 subtypes and 20 fields. Is there any way to set the domains to be the same for all the subtypes rather than having to set them for each subtype? Yes, Dan, a simple way to do this might be to open the toolbox up, go to the data management tools and look under domains to see the second tool there is assign domain to field. That will let you assign the same domain to all the fields in your subtype feature class. Andre from Chelmsford asks, how do you set a date as a default? Well, you heard Colin say you don't have to set the default date, and you'll get today's date for a date type field. But if you wish to, you can enter a date for a default. Just use your Windows locality setting style of date entry, and that will appear and be used as your default date. Roger from Blacksburg asks, will validation be enforced when you save your edits if you don't check the validate features first? Well, Roger, no, it won't be. But something to help you, you might want to look into is go to our EdenDocs site, search for a customization tool called Validate Rows in a geodatabase table, add that customization to ArcMap, and that will let you check or validate your fields after they've been saved. Elizabeth from Uticus asks, when editing an ArcMap, can a user add a value to a coded value domain? Well, Elizabeth, provided you can obtain a schema lock on the geodatabase, you can open up a geoprocessing tool under the domains toolbox again, say the top one, add coded value to domain. And then in the geoprocessing environment, we'll take care of adding the value that you need. And then next time you try and use the value when you're editing, it will appear inside that edit session. Tola from Anderson asks, can you have multiple ranged domains in one field? Well, Tola, no. The ranges that we use for domains are simple ranges. I know you may be aware that in your geodatabase, ranges can be complex and have gaps in them. But in our implementation, the range is a simple one, and you can't have multiple ranged domains. Virginia from Carroll Stream, Illinois asks, what are splits and merges as applied to domains? I noticed these options in the demo. Well, Virginia, these are a field property that we manage through domains, which lets you do things like assign a new value when you divide a feature based on, for example, its area, or when you merge two features into one, you might do, again, work on the sum of the two areas and recalculate a value on that basis. It's a handy way to automate for you properties which are related to field geometry, feature geometry. Victoria from Palatka asks, as far as auto-validating, can you validate an entire feature class to discover any features that do not respect domains? Well, you could use select by query, Victoria, and do it manually, or you might like to refer to the validate rows in the geodatabase downloadable tool that I mentioned in one of the earlier questions. Adam from Boston asks, what would a value that does not agree with the domain look like in a field in the attribute table? Well, it look like any normal value, Adam. The fact that it's lying outside the domain would not be flagged for you or highlighted. You will have to research and validate your data independently of just looking at it. We have time for one more question. Michelle from Fort Lauderdale asks, can you set a domain for a text field? You most certainly can, Michelle. It would have to be a coded value domain, though. You cannot set a range domain for a text field. I'll hand back to Colin to wrap up.
Thank you very much, Bruce. So everybody, in recap, for attribute data validation, the things you need to look out for are to potentially set default values, to look at the allow null values settings for yes and no and see whether they do things for you that you need to have happen or not in your data. You may want to look at subtypes as a mechanism of categorizing and grouping your features, and then having unique default values or unique domains per subtype. You may want to look at domains as a mechanism of constraining what kind of value somebody may be able to put into an attribute field for you, either by using a range domain with a min and max value or using a coded value domain with a list of codes to pick from. And then you may want to consider combining the use of subtypes and then different domains per subtype as a mechanism of maintaining your attribute data validation. So before we go, I'd like to point out a few resources for you. We have several web training classes that do cover some of these topics. Working with geodatabases, subtypes, and domains is a web training class. Editing in ArcGIS 9, tips and tricks 1, 2, and 3 have other additional tips and tricks for you. Creating and editing geodatabase features with ArcGIS Desktop, the web training class, also has some good information. If you have the option to take an instructor-led training class, our ArcGIS Desktop 2 class entitled Tools and Functionality, that covers a lot about subtypes and domains, as does the Building Geodatabase class, and within the Data Production and Editing Techniques class, we also cover some topics related to subtypes and domains. Some other resources that we want to point you to is the ArcScripts environment, where there is a geodatabase domains tool script that you may want to consider looking at. And now, do remember your comments help us improve our seminars. Please take a moment to complete our survey. Just give us feedback link on the option, a click to take the survey. We hope you enjoyed today's seminar, and on behalf of the SRI, I'd like to thank you all for attending.